Hey everyone,
Hey everybody.
welcome to another travel therapy mentor video. Tonight we're going to be talking about starting your travel contract. Last week we went in depth on finding contracts, moving, all that stuff. Now we're actually talking about some of the logistics and some of the things you might run into starting your travel contract. It's been about a month since our last video, and that is because we started our own contracts. We're going into week 4 now. So starting the whole process again made us realize some of the things that we'd forgotten about and some things that you guys will probably have questions about starting your own travel contract. So Whitney's going to introduce us, and I'm going to get this video shared in a couple groups.
All right. Hey, thanks for joining us. For those that may not know us, my name is Whitney.
I'm Jared.
And we're both traveling doctors of physical therapy, and we've been travel PTs for about 9 years now. So we work part-time now as travel PTs. We take off several months at a time. This is actually our first travel therapy contract in about a year and a half almost. The last travel therapy contract that we did was in the summer of 2022, and that was back when we went to Alaska. So it's been a little while since we took a contract, and we wanted to tell you a little bit about our contract and then also just the process of getting started your first couple of weeks on a new travel therapy contract as well. As Jared said, he's going to share the video in a couple of groups so more people can tune in with us live. And shout out to those of you that will listen later on the podcast and YouTube as well. If you have not joined us for videos in the past, we've been doing these off and on for how many years? 5 years or so. I think we started back in 2019, and we have videos and podcasts about all kinds of different travel therapy topics. So we've probably talked a little bit about this before in the past, but it's always good to go back through it and discuss some new things, especially for newer followers. So to give you a little background on our contract, so we are actually working only a couple hours from where we're from in Virginia. We're currently working in Charlottesville, Virginia. It's a pretty nice area. It's somewhere that we've wanted to spend more time. There's lots of history, lots of nature around here. It's also a college town, so a lot going on, a really fun place to be. So we're really excited that we were able to find contracts here. We typically work outpatient. We have worked in other settings in the past. We've taken hospital jobs, skilled nursing, we've done a little bit of home health, but we typically try to take outpatient jobs. So our last several contracts, when we worked in Alaska in 22 and we worked in Hawaii in 21, we've been really spoiled with one-on-one outpatient. And so we were really hoping to find something that was one-on-one outpatient again. But unfortunately, after searching for several weeks, we just really weren't seeing much in Virginia that would work for us that was one-on-one. There really were not a lot of hospital-based outpatient, which is where you tend to see more of the one-on-ones. Everything was pretty much private practice. So it became clear that that probably wasn't going to happen if we wanted to stay in Virginia for this contract, which we did. We wanted to be closer to home for this contract because we have some obligations this spring and summer back home. So we ended up having to go with a private practice. Now, the other thing that we were being pretty particular on is the last couple contracts that we've done them actually part-time, which is not typical for travel therapy contracts. So for those of you that are getting started with travel therapy, most contracts are a regular 40-hour work week. Every now and then you might see one that says you may only work 36 hours or so, or they may only guarantee 36 hours, so you might be somewhere between 36 and 40. But by and large, most travel therapy contracts are full-time. But because we have reached financial independence through travel therapy and we no longer work full-time as physical therapists, and we also have our online business, we wanted to find a contract that would do part-time. And in the past, we've been able to negotiate this with some outpatient clinics. And typically, especially if it's like a private practice or a physician-owned, they are pretty flexible with working with you on that. So we haven't actually had that much trouble with finding places that were willing to work with us. It also does help, I think, because we're a pair. So we're kind of presenting ourselves like, you're going to get 4 days a week of coverage. Even though, we each only want to work 2 days a week. So I think that definitely helps our case. But in Hawaii, I was the only one who worked, and I worked 3 days a week, and they were still able to accommodate that. So it's definitely worth asking if you have some interest in doing part-time contracts, but it's not typical. And I don't know how other settings would accept that. Especially bigger hospital systems probably wouldn't be able to accommodate that request. But like I said, when we're working with these smaller private practices, they have a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, you might be able to find part-time contracts with home health or maybe even skilled nursing. But yeah, outpatient, that's what we prefer anyway, so we haven't really gone out of our way to look at other settings. But there are pros and cons to part-time contracts. We get that question a lot. People find out we're traveling part-time and they're like, oh, I'm going to do that. And there's a lot of benefits to it, but some downsides as well. And that kind of goes into starting your first week and things like that, because we've always talked about in these videos, and we've written about as well, that the first week of a new contract is pretty tough. And it's because, you're learning the documentation system, you have a whole new caseload, you have new coworkers, new equipment to find around the clinic. Things like that are difficult. And even when you're prepared for it, it's hard. And if you take a part-time contract, especially like us working 2 days a week, well, it's more days, more weeks until you feel comfortable in the clinic. So normally at a normal contract, within the first week, like probably Friday or Monday of the second week, we're feeling pretty good in the clinic. We feel like we are getting things down. We're learning the documentation system. 2 days a week though, for 5 days in the clinic, it's 2.5 weeks. So that's something that we struggle with a little bit here, because starting the second week, it was only our 3rd day in the clinic and it still felt pretty new, and we're still struggling a little bit with the documentation system, but it feels like we should be doing better because it's our second week. So pros and cons definitely to part-time contracts.
And obviously for most people, part-time is not going to work out financially, right? Like, it's a big commitment to move to a new state and have to pay rent and everything if you're only working part-time. I would say that this is a very rare circumstance for someone that is either semi-retired like we are, or has a side hustle or some type of business reason that they're doing on the other days of the week, so there is a reason why they want to work part-time. But we have talked to some therapists that are interested in doing less than 40 hours. There are some therapists that would prefer to do more like 32 or 36. I definitely think that's a lot more of a reasonable request that you could work out with a facility, to do just a little bit less hours, so you'd have a better work-life balance, rather than something more extreme, like we're literally only working 16 hours a week.
Yeah, I think 32, a situation like that, you could definitely find something that might work for you.
Yeah. Shout out to those of you guys that are watching live. We'd love if you'd say hello in the comments and just let us know you're watching. Feel free to also ask any questions as we go through this topic. Let us know if you have any questions in the comments. So a little bit more about our contract. So as we mentioned, we're working for a private practice outpatient. It worked out that this particular company has multiple locations in the area. And so we told them, whatever worked best for them, we could both work in the same facility, or we could work at 2 different clinics, just like whatever they needed. And that helped too with our flexibility, made it more accommodating for them. So when we signed our contracts, they actually said they could use us both at the same facility. And so that was the plan, is that Jared was going to work Monday, Wednesday at this clinic, and I was going to work Tuesday, Thursday. That's what we agreed to. However, about a few days before we were getting ready to start, like probably 4 days before our start date, the manager called us and said that they had some change in their staffing, and they wanted to know if one of us could go to another clinic that was a little further away for a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, this clinic was 45 minutes away, which is beyond what we usually would prefer to commute, because back when we were discussing it with him and telling him that we would be willing to go to other clinics, they were a little bit more within like a 20-minute drive.
And we also hadn't found housing at that point. So
Right.
When we were talking about trying to meet their needs, if we knew it was 2 clinics that were far away, we would have found something in the middle. But we'd already found housing, we were already moving in. So we couldn't really change it at that point.
Yeah, so it kind of put us in a tricky situation. And I want to bring this up because it's not just something that's happened to us. We have talked to so many other clinicians where right before they're about to start their contract, or maybe even while they're on their contract, the facility tried to switch things up on them. And we've heard it quite often where they're like, oh, it turns out now we need you at this other facility, or they might ask you to split time between facilities.
Yeah,
and
this is fairly common.
so it can put you in a really tricky situation. So, we really wanted to say no, like we don't want to drive 45 minutes. We didn't agree to this. We didn't sign the contract. You're springing this on us a few days before we're about to start. So that was really frustrating. But at the same time, we understand that they were in a tricky situation. The clinic that had the need was more rural. So it's in an area where they're having even more trouble staffing. So, in a way we want to help them out. And so we were like, maybe we can try to make this work. If it's only going to be for 2 weeks, they said it was only going to be for the first 2 weeks. So we ended up making a compromise where I would end up going to that clinic for the 2 weeks, which really meant just 4 days. It was just 2 days a week for 2 weeks. If they shortened my day by an hour and instead paid me mileage to offset my costs of driving out there. And so it didn't work out, exactly even, obviously, because I was getting paid 1 hour less. But for my personal situation, I just didn't want to have a super long day. And the money wasn't really that important to me, except that I just thought they should accommodate me in some way. So I just want to take note of that was a little bit stressful for us. You could find yourself in that situation. If you find yourself in that situation, try to see if you can work out something that's a compromise for both of you. You can obviously always just say no, but it kind of depends on what situation you're in, if you have a better option, because sometimes if you say no, they might end up saying, we might have to end your contract.
Yeah, and if it's before you started, then that puts you in a really bad situation, especially if you already have housing, if you're already in the area. So you have to really think about, you have to feel out the situation. Every situation is different. There are some cases where, it might not be a good fit. Like say you've already found housing and they want you to go an hour away. You say no. They say, well, we don't have any need at this clinic anymore. And then it just doesn't work out. That's pretty rare, but sometimes that could happen. But in most cases, if you talk to them, you're able to work out some compromise like we did, a shorter day, paid for mileage, then, it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, and I think it really just depends. This goes back to knowing the supply and demand and the job market. So if you're in a situation where if you put your foot down and say no, and the worst case scenario is they cancel your contract, but you know that you have tons of other options, then, be firm about it. If you know that there's other jobs in that area, or you haven't already committed to housing and there's other jobs that you could go to somewhere else, then go for it. But if, for example, you're really dead set on being in that area and there's no other jobs in that area and you've already found housing, then it could be in your best interest to try to work out a compromise with them. But I do understand it can be extremely frustrating if they switch things up on you. But in the travel therapy world, there's no guarantees because staffing can fluctuate. And if they are hiring you because they have a shortage at a certain facility, but then they, between the time you agreed to your contract and the time you start, things change. Maybe they hire somebody at one facility, but now they need somebody over here. It can happen.
Yeah, and this has happened to us a few times, and you have to take each situation on a case-by-case basis. And some cases, or in one case, we did say no, and it was okay. We ended up working it out. And a couple other cases, we did end up doing what they asked us to do, driving further or whatever, but there was always some kind of accommodation or some kind of increased pay or, something to make up for it.
Yeah, and so this is where you'd have to go back to work with your recruiter to see, what can we do here? If I agree to do this thing that I don't want to do, can they compensate me in some other way, or can we compromise somehow? So that was something that kind of was unexpected with starting our new contract that made it a little bit frustrating the first couple weeks. Then on top of that, it was just harder for us to jump back into these clinic environments. As I mentioned, the past couple years, we've been doing a lot of one-on-one, and these clinics do double booking. I would say that they're not by any means like a PT mill. They're not the worst clinics we've ever heard of, but they're not one-on-one either. And so it's been a little tough for us to adjust to the double booking and the busier caseload. And the big thing, I think, was the documentation system. It's a new documentation system we've never used, and it's among the worst.
It is a really slow documentation system. And yeah, the double booking, for me especially, I haven't had double booking patients for 4 years or something. So trying to jump back into that and trying to juggle 2 patients at the same time is pretty difficult, especially for the first 2 or 3 days. But like I said earlier, it really is, this really reminded me how difficult the first week is as a new traveler and how it's always going to feel pretty daunting. And I remember that when we were working full time, like my first week, I would always have doubts and I'd be like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to adapt to this documentation system. And those all came back. And so on the second week, we'd only worked 2 days. I'm still struggling with the documentation. I'm like, man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this. But now, after 3 weeks, feeling really good about it. Like, you learn the patients. Now I feel like I've eval'd a lot of my own patients. I'm seeing them in the clinic. It's just a lot easier once you get in the swing of things. You know the patients, you know the staff. You're better with the documentation system. It all really gets better after a week or 2 weeks.
Rachel asked, by double booking, do we mean concurrent? So Rachel, it sounds like maybe you might work more in skilled nursing or more like inpatient settings where concurrent treatment is something that they do there. We're talking about outpatient facilities. So if you're not so familiar with like outpatient PT, or it could be the same for outpatient OT or SLP, I think it's not quite as common in outpatient OT and SLP just because of the type of work you're doing. But for outpatient physical therapy, there are situations where they will have you double booked in the same time slot with 2 patients. Different clinics do it different ways. And again, we have done this before. We've been PTs for 9 years. We've worked in all kinds of outpatient clinics. And we've done this type of schedule before. It's just been a little while. So it could look something like at these particular clinics, well, actually the one that Jared's been working at, it's 2 on the hour. So every hour that you have treatments, they schedule 2 people at the top of the hour. So you have the same 2 people for a full 60 minutes. And then at the next 60-minute mark, 2 more people come in, unless it's an evaluation. And in that case, it's all one-on-one for a new evaluation. But yes, seeing 2 patients at once is basically what we mean by double booking. There are other clinics that do more of like an overlapping system. So we've worked at a lot of clinics before where they schedule the patients on the half hour, but they expect you to keep them for an hour. So you'd have like one at 8, another one comes in at 8:30, but your 8 o'clock is still there. And then when your 8 o'clock leaves, somebody else comes in at 9, but your 8:30 is still there, and so forth and so on. So yeah, we've done it before. It's just been a little while, and it's harder to keep up with, especially in the first couple of weeks when you don't know the patients, because you're having to get to know the patients. So each one is almost like a little mini evaluation for you. You're having a chart review for every single patient. You're still getting used to the documentation system, so the efficiency is just not there the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter how experienced you are. It's going to be stressful that first week, especially if you're seeing double book treatments that you've never seen before, and especially if you don't have much time to chart review and you're just trying to figure it out on the fly. It's very difficult. So we struggle with that at first, but it has gotten significantly better. These clinics are definitely not bad. Double booking is hard, but I mean, honestly, anybody that's not familiar with outpatient PT, private practices almost can't operate anymore with reimbursement rates where they are doing any kind of one-on-one treatment. It's really difficult for them. So almost the only one-on-one treatments you'll see for outpatient clinics are either hospital-based or physician-owned, and occasionally in states that have high reimbursement rates. But most states, like they wouldn't be able to stay in business if they were doing one-on-one. So they have to do something with having more than one patient there somehow. And so yeah, either they'll do the overlapping on the 30 minutes or double booking on the hour. Obviously, there are some really crazy clinics that might do double booking on the half hour, but we would never take those contracts.
Yeah. So our first 2 weeks were a little bit of a challenge. I went to the other clinic for a while. They were even more short-staffed than Jared's clinic, so my schedule was even busier than Jared's for those first 2 weeks, and I was driving 45 minutes each way. So I had a pretty tough first 2 weeks, but those 2 weeks have passed, and I'm no longer going to that clinic. And so the plan on the 3rd week was for me to start back at the clinic I'm supposed to be at with Jared. However, right before that, they actually had another change in staffing. I'm telling you, staffing is just all over the place. Life is unpredictable. They never know. The other PT at a 3rd clinic location had a family emergency and had to go out. And so suddenly they needed somebody at a completely different clinic. Luckily, this clinic is just as close to our house as the clinic I was supposed to be working at. So that wasn't a concern. And so I said, it's fine. I'll go there. I'm going to have to switch clinics and start a new caseload anyway. And that clinic has been phenomenal. Actually, it's been a lot slower paced than what Jared's has been. So my 3rd week was great. And all along, both of us are getting better with the documentation system and all that. So it's definitely getting better, but those first 2 weeks are always a little bit stressful.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest hurdles of starting any contract is learning the documentation system if you're not familiar with it. And some documentation systems, even if you are familiar, sometimes each clinic will have their own way of doing things, or they might have slight variations. Like some of the documentation systems, they'll have almost like specialized versions of the software for the clinic or that practice. And so you run into situations where even if you are familiar, you might still struggle. But if it's a brand new system that is fairly slow, it can be pretty difficult to be efficient. And you feel like bad because you're there forever because you're still learning the documentation system, but it's not your fault. And you have to realize that every traveler is in that situation. And the first week learning it is going to be hard, and the manager and the staff should understand that.
Yeah. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, and then we can kind of intertwine a little bit of our experience too. But to back up just a sec and just kind of give you a general overview of what it might look like as you are starting a new contract. So we talked in our last video a couple weeks ago, as Jared mentioned, about just the general process of getting started and finding a contract. Hopefully you have found your contract. Usually it's about a month in advance or so. Every now and then it'll be a little more than a month or a little less. But during their phone interview, when you talk to the clinic, you should have somewhat of an idea. You should have asked during the interview, what is my ramp up time going to look like? Like, what are my first couple days or my first week going to look like? You should have a decent idea of that. So then when you go to have your first day, you should have received some communication the week beforehand of what your first day instructions are. And usually this comes either if you have a direct contact with the manager, sometimes directly from the manager, or sometimes they'll send it through your recruiter. So you always want to make sure that you have that those instructions before the Friday of the week prior, because you don't want to just show up on the Monday and be like, wait a minute, nobody told me where to go or what to do. So the week before your contract starts, make sure that you get your first day instructions. This might be, where to go, the address, the building, the time to be there, who's the contact person that you're going to meet, because sometimes it can be really awkward. You just show up to this desk and you're like, hi, I'm the traveler, I'm here to work, but you don't know who to ask for. It helps if you can be like, okay, I'm here for Bob, the manager, whatever. It's really important that you ask these questions, because sometimes they have you go somewhere the first day that's not where your regular job is going to be. They might have you train at a different location, just depending on what their training system is like.
That happens often with clinics that have multiple locations, and maybe the regional manager or the training person is at one central location, but you're going to be working at a different clinic. We've had that happen several times where we train in one location and then maybe our first day is there, learning the documentation system, doing modules or something like that, and then we start at our actual clinic on the second day.
Or if it's a hospital system, sometimes they have like set orientation for all staff members. So sometimes when we've worked at hospitals, you do like a set hospital orientation at a completely different place with nurses and CNAs and other staff members that all do it at once, because they have to have you go through like hospital training and that sort of thing. So be sure to ask, where am I supposed to go the first day? You also want to know like, what's the dress code? What should I wear the first day? So hopefully you have your first day instructions. You know what to do, what to expect, and then you get there, and hopefully you have like a little bit of an idea of whether you're going to start treating patients that day or not.
Yeah, you definitely want to ask about that and hopefully know ahead of time what it's going to be like, what you're going to walk into. That's something that we did not know when we started. Our first couple contracts, we were just kind of showing up and just seeing what happened, and it puts you in a pretty stressful situation if it's something where you show up and you're expected to see a patient 30 minutes later, and you're trying to log into the computer, or you're trying to do all these things, you're trying to find stuff around the clinic. So, ideally you have some sort of ramp up time and you've discussed that ahead of time. For us, that was the morning. So for 4 hours we had training, modules and training about the documentation system. So that was helpful.
Yeah, so you should kind of get an idea of, what to expect your first day. You may even want to ask things like, am I going to have my own laptop? Do I have logins already? Every now and then they'll ask you to do some stuff before you start. It's up to your own discretion to determine how much you're willing to do before you start and really get on the clock. If it's something simple like, hey, we're going to send you some login information, can you just make sure that you have it, or maybe log into the site and just fill out something. And if it takes you less than like an hour, whatever it is they need you to do before you start, as far as your onboarding and stuff, well, let me say it like this. If it's onboarding and credentialing, which means like filling out paperwork for credentialing for different insurances, getting your background check, doing all those types of things, like that's to be expected. That's going to take you a couple hours every contract. Sometimes you have to get a drug screen, a TB test, all that kind of stuff. That's going to take you a couple hours. That's unpaid. It's just expected. It's normal. But if they start asking you to try to do training, where you'd have to do like a lot of modules, a lot of stuff that's going to take multiple hours, this is when you need to talk to your recruiter about, hey, I should be getting paid for this training. I'm not going to do 6 hours of training before I ever start a contract unless you're going to account for it on my timesheet my first week.
Yeah. So in that situation, either you can get paid for it up front, like doing it at home, and you get paid for however many hours it takes you, or maybe they just decide to wait until you start and then you do the training there on the clock.
Yeah, so but definitely differentiate between what is training and what is just like onboarding and credentialing, because it's pretty normal to have to do a couple hours of onboarding and credentialing before, but if it's like specific job training, like for the EMR, or the hospital has you do modules on HIPAA and bloodborne pathogens and all that kind of stuff, like that should be stuff that you're getting paid for, whether they need you to do it before the first day or they do it when you get there.
Yep.
So hopefully you have a little bit of an idea of what it's going to look like your first week. This can vary significantly. As Jared said, our contract, they informed us that we would have about 4 hours of training the first day, and then we would see patients the second half of the day. They also let us know that it would be one-on-one that first day, so they would only schedule us one patient an hour as we got used to things, and then kind of ramp us up from there on subsequent days, and that is what happened, and that was great. It could be different, like every clinic is different, every facility is different. Sometimes you might get 2 whole days of training, or 3. Jared had a job where he had like how did that go exactly?
It was like a week of shadowing and then like a week of a partial caseload, and then I started basically on my third week.
Yeah, and so I would say that was the longest training or ramp up period that we ever had, and that was great. I've had even shorter ones, like I've had a skilled nursing job where they barely gave me any orientation, like maybe 2 hours the first day, and then gave me a schedule. So it can vary a lot depending on how it goes, but hopefully it meets the expectations of what you kind of discussed before. However, if it doesn't, if they give you way more than what you were expecting the first week, there may be certain situations where you need to talk to the manager and be like, hey, this isn't what we talked about, or in certain situations talk to your recruiter as well.
Yeah, if it's a situation where what you discussed on the phone is not at all what it's like, then that's something you need to, as soon as possible, talk to the manager, talk to a recruiter about. I would say that's fairly rare. We haven't really had any situations that it was vastly different than what we expected, but we have heard some travelers say that has happened to them. So I wouldn't say it's common, but if there's a situation where you talk to the manager, you ask about the scheduling, and they say double booking on the hour, whatever, you're expected to see 12 patients a day, and then you get there and you have 18 scheduled or 20 scheduled, okay, well then you need to talk to the manager, talk to your recruiter, and get that sorted out. But in most cases, you'll have what you expect, and it will be harder than you think it'll be because everything is new to you.
Yeah. One big issue that arises a lot is, let me say one more thing. The first couple weeks are hard, like we mentioned, because they're all new patients to you, new documentation system, you're just getting used to everything. I will also say, especially for outpatients, sometimes in the beginning, you have a lot more evaluations than you would have in a typical week. And that can be really overwhelming for some people because they're like, they gave me 5 or 6 evaluations a day, and so how am I supposed to get 5 or 6 evaluations a day typed and get out of there on time? And it's just overwhelming. And so it's good to discuss with the manager, is this just because it's my first week and I'm building my caseload, or is it always going to be like this? In most circumstances, it's just the beginning because they need you to build your caseload, and then subsequently ask them what the expectation is. Am I usually going to have just 1 or 2 evals a day? In our experience, that's usually how it is. But that doesn't make the first week or so suck less, right?
Yeah. Nick said he's in Milwaukee. He just started a contract there. How's your contract going, Nick? How's your first week? Let us know.
So again, you need to have open communication with the manager to understand the expectations and realize it usually gets better after the first week or so. But what you can run into here with all these circumstances, new patients, new EMR, maybe more evals than usual, getting used to everything, is that you're having trouble doing it all within your time frame, like whatever that might be, 40 hours or an 8-hour day or a 10-hour day, whatever it is. You're having trouble getting it all done because you're not proficient yet. It's going to be harder in the beginning. So if that's the case, there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. We've talked about this before. What we typically do is we just write down all of our time because we're hourly employees. If it takes us longer on the first week, because it's going to, we're not up to speed yet, we just write our time down, and then usually it may end up sparking a conversation the following week. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes they're just like, yeah, that's fine. I mean, whatever. You had to work 41 hours or 42 hours the first week. Cool. That's fine. Sometimes it will spark a conversation. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we can't pay you overtime. And then we'll say, okay, well, these are the reasons why it took me longer. Like we talked about, the patients are all new. I'm getting used to the EMR. You gave me a bunch of evals the first week. So that's the amount of time it took me, so I wrote it down. If it continues to be an issue the second week and the third week and so forth and so on, and it's still sparking a conversation, that's when you have to talk to the manager and be like, well, look, I agreed to see this many patients, but you've been giving me this many patients. Or we've had situations where it was like, you've been putting evals at the very last slot of the day. How am I supposed to get out of there in time? And so sometimes if they're really firm on not wanting to pay you overtime, then they'll adjust your schedule for you, or work out some kind of compromise.
It's a difficult situation. We are pretty lenient on the first week. So say we're staying like 15 or 30 minutes over, finishing stuff up on the first week. It's not a huge deal. But if it's an hour, hour and a half, staying and finishing documentation because the documentation system is hard to learn or it's slow or whatever, that's not your fault. So you should definitely put that on your timesheet. But it's pretty often, especially in outpatient clinics, that you'll end up having to have a conversation about extra time or those types of things in the first week or two, because it's going to probably take you a little longer. And like Whitney said, it's a case-by-case basis. Some managers have no issue with it. Some managers will say, you know, it was supposed to be that you had worked 40 hours and you get all this done. And then you have this conversation where it's like, well, you know, it is slower the first week and I did stay here all this time. And managers cannot encourage you to work off the clock. It's illegal to do that. As an hourly employee, you get in there, you start your time, and then when you leave, you end your time. Like, there's no gray area there. So if a manager is encouraging you to work off the clock, that's illegal to do. So you sometimes have to remind them that, like, as far as the Fair Standards and Labor Act, I think is what it is, you have to remind them that any time on the clock, any time doing work duties, including meetings, including things like that, that is work time.
Yeah. And I think it's hard a lot of times, especially if they haven't worked with travelers before, because a lot of times they're used to employees who are salaried. And so when you're salaried, you know, you just do the work, and as much time as it takes you, that's how much time it takes you. And also, especially for outpatient and for home health, quite often you take your documentation home when you're a salaried employee, and you just do it on your own time. You know, it's just part of your job duties. And so we get that all the time when we work outpatient clinics. They'll say, like, you can take your laptop home. Yeah, you can just get it done at home. But what that means is they want you to work off the clock. Sometimes it's nefarious and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just that they're kind of accustomed to that's the way that salaried people do it. So you may have to just remind them, like, no, I'm an hourly employee. But I will say, like Jared mentioned, like, we are a little bit lenient, like, especially the first week. Say that we ended up having a long lunch because we didn't have a patient show up or something, or we end up having like a lot of downtime, but then at the end of the day it gets busy and then we're there an extra half hour. Well, then we're going to kind of like account for that half hour earlier that we were free, that we were just doing our own thing, and I was, you know, checking my email. And I'm like, yeah, I was here 30 minutes late, but also I had 30 minutes of free time earlier. So we don't always like put the exact in and out time if it's within reason, but if like it's consistently like, oh, I'm having to stay here a whole extra hour, then we're going to put it down.
Yeah, so don't get bullied into just staying there for 9 hours and saying that you were there for 8. We see that happen to travelers pretty often, and you don't have to do that. That's completely in your rights to write the time you got there and write the time you leave, as long as you're doing that accurately. And the manager has to adjust to that. And, you know, that's part of being an hourly employee.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's tricky because, like, sometimes you might feel like, well, maybe it's my fault. Maybe I'm just not as good as these other therapists because I'm not used to this setting, or because I'm a new grad, or because whatever. But that should all be accounted for with the fact that they hired a traveler, and that you're not going to, no one, even us with 9 years of experience, is going to be able to just pick everything up the same as someone who has been there for a long time and be 100% efficient the first week. It's just not possible. So yes, of course, there is some gray area there. Maybe if you felt like, again, sometimes like if I felt like, oh, I was just really slow today because I took too many breaks, or I could have been a little bit more efficient, you know, I'll let it go 15 minutes here or there. But for the most part, like if we realize I'm doing the darn best I can, I'm doing everything in my power, and I still can't get it done in 8 hours, then we write it down.
Yeah, the way I usually handle that is if I'm on the clock, I'm working as hard as I possibly can. So if there's ever any question about that, I'm not going out of my way to have conversations unless I'm caught up on everything. Like if coworkers try to talk to you, yes, you can answer, but, you know, stay on top of your documentation so that then you don't get to the end of the day and you're staying late, and then the manager's like, well, I saw you talking to the PTA and stuff like that. So, you know, try to get your stuff done, work as hard as you can on the clock. If it takes you longer than the scheduled hours, then put that time down.
Yeah. And so we're just kind of going over this because this is something we've encountered time and time again, and it usually gets addressed the first couple weeks. If you realize it's going to be a problem, that's when you just need to go ahead and just get it addressed one way or the other, whether it's you kind of passively write it on your timesheet and just see what happens, or whether you decide to approach the manager. In certain circumstances, it just kind of depends on, like, is the manager on site with you? Is that somebody you're seeing and interacting every day with? Then maybe it's more appropriate just to, like, have a chat with them first. But if they're not, or if there's some other reason that you don't feel comfortable having that conversation with the manager, then you can go talk to your recruiter about it too and be like, hey, this is what's going on.
Yeah, but one thing I really want to encourage everybody and reinforce is that the first week or two is always going to feel overwhelming. And we've gotten so many messages from people that are on like Wednesday of their first week, and they're like, I don't think I'm going to be able to stay at this contract. I need to get out of it. And always we're like, just give it a few more days, because we can vividly remember the situations where we felt like we were overwhelmed. And then 3 days later, 4 days later, it's like, oh, this is not a big deal. Now I feel great. I know these patients, I know the documentation system, I'm much faster. Everything feels so much better. And if you don't give it that time, if you, on day 2, you're like really struggling and you think it's always going to be like that, it's not always going to be like that. The first week, the first few days are going to be tough, and it gets better.
There have been a lot of times where we felt like we're going to have to quit this contract. We're going to have to put in our notice. We have never put in our notice with a contract. We've never quit a contract before. So you have to distinguish between what types of situations are going to improve with time versus what you would really have to draw a hard line on. So obviously, if you get to a place and you're noticing that it's just a terrible work environment, it's very toxic, there's ethical issues, there's legal issues, that's a different situation. That's something where you absolutely need to talk to your recruiter and tell them exactly what's going on. And there are certain circumstances where you might just have to say, I have to leave. Like, this is not a good contract for me. I can't stay here and work anymore. But if it's something where it's just like, it feels busy, it feels hard, try to stick it out for a couple weeks. We always say, typically, in most circumstances, you can do anything for 13 weeks. Even if it's not your favorite contract, you can usually get through it. But again, we've never put in our notice before, and you should really reserve that for very extreme circumstances.
Yeah, either unethical situations, like Whitney said, say they're really encouraging you to bill incorrectly and they're not budging on that, then of course, you want to get out of that situation. You don't want to risk your license for any job, much less a travel contract. Or anything that's unsafe for you or the patients, like those types of situations, you want to get out of it. But in most cases, it's just difficult. Or I would say another situation is, say, you do have a lot of evals, and it's going to be that way. Say you have 5 evals every day, and the documentation system is slow, and it's going to be that way, and the manager says this is just what it's going to be like, and they're unwilling to give you any extra time or pay any overtime or make any accommodations. Okay, well, that's a situation where how are you going to do it?
Yep.
You can't be there and get everything done in 40 hours, and if they won't pay you for more, then you would put in your notice in that situation. But it's very, very rare that they're not going to work with you because they don't want to find another traveler and you don't want to have to go find a new job. You already have housing and everything. So in almost all situations, you can find some compromise.
Yeah, if it's like a caseload or a productivity issue, usually you can try to work it out. Always try to go that route first of trying to work out some type of compromise one way or the other. It's really more if it's like an ethical or legal situation. Those are the situations where you might consider talking to your recruiter about what are your rights, can I get out of this contract type of thing. And if it's something really terrible, typically you need to put in whatever type of notice you have, give them 2 weeks notice or a month's notice. But if it's something just like horrendous, there are certain situations where you can just quit on the spot. But again, we encourage you to try to work things out with a manager, try to work things out with your recruiter. It's not good to just quit a contract unless you have some really extreme circumstances.
Yep.
So I see some questions and comments. If anybody else has any questions or comments, please leave them below. When we get toward the end of the video, we will go through everything and answer all your questions. Also, if you have gained anything from this video, if you've learned anything, we'd love if you'd hit the thumbs up button. If you're watching or listening on another platform like YouTube or podcast later, we'd love also if you would just subscribe as well so you can catch future videos. So we talked a little bit about what this first couple weeks might look like as far as your contract goes. Circumstances where you may have to have a discussion with a manager or your recruiter, circumstances where you may have to put in your notice. But hopefully, for the most part, you don't have these issues. For the most part, after the first couple weeks, you're eased in, things are going well, you're enjoying it. I think also we want to talk a little bit about just getting used to the area and like what's going on outside of work.
Yeah, that's always the most fun part, honestly. Most clinics are, once you get used to it, they're pretty similar, especially if you're working in the same setting. But every area is different, and there's so much to learn, and you can learn so much from patients. We've talked about this in the past, but it's so much fun to me to talk to patients, especially older patients and outpatient or skilled nursing or whatever, that have lived in an area their entire lives, and they want to tell you all the cool things about the area. You tell them you're a traveler, and they're like, oh, well, have you eaten at this place? Have you gone and hiked at this place? That's one of my favorite things about being a traveler, is having these people that if you were just going to visit an area, you would never interact with someone for such a long time that they could really give you all their recommendations about an area. But as a traveler, you're seeing them for an hour and you have nothing to do but talk to them and work with them. And so very often your coworkers, your patients will love to tell you about things to do. And in those situations, try to dig into that, try to figure out which things you want to do, make a list of the things you want to do, because 13 weeks really goes by fast. And before you know it, you'll be halfway done, and then you're looking for your next contract. So make sure you make a list of the things that people recommend to you, or that you find online that are recommended to do around the area within a couple hours drive. And make sure you start checking those things off, because before you know it, the contract will be over and it's time to move on.
It really does go by so quick. I cannot believe that we're already 3 weeks into this contract. So the first 2 weeks that we were here, we had some obligations out of town. And so we didn't even get to do anything fun. So this past weekend was the first time we actually got to go out and do something fun. And now that the weekend is over, I'm like, oh my gosh, I started looking at the calendar, and we do have some other obligations throughout the contract. And I was like, we only have actually 6 or 7 more weekends to do things. So I'm like, we really have to make sure to look at the hikes that we want to do, and the different places that we want to go and eat and all that. So it can go by so quick. But this is the most exciting and fun part of being a traveler, is getting to know a new area, whether it's something grand and extreme, like you're going to go and do these amazing new things you've never done, or even the small stuff. To be honest, we have fun just going to our new gym, going to our new grocery store, trying out the new local coffee shop, checking out the new local farmers market, walking around the neighborhood and trying a new little trail. Some people like to get involved in the community and volunteer or try a club. Sometimes you'll have coworkers that you can hang out with. So it's a really exciting time, and not all contracts are great. Not all of them are bad either. Sometimes you'll have a phenomenal clinic facility that you just absolutely love, the patients and the coworkers and everything is wonderful. Sometimes they're just kind of meh, you're I don't think I would work here full time, but it's all right. But the amazing part about travel therapy is, not just the work environment, but what you're doing on the weekends and the experiences that you're having in the new place.
Yeah, I definitely make a list and just check those things off, because those are the things we really appreciate about each place we've gone, and being able to experience the new things. And when we move on, reflecting back on that place, what we remember more than the clinic is all the things we did around the area.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yeah. And we also want to just point out that if you get into a contract and it's not exactly what you expected, just remember it's not forever. And I would say that we've grown a lot as clinicians from some of those bad work environments, just as much as from some of the good work environments. We learned the good stuff, and then we also learned the bad stuff that we're okay, this is the stuff to look out for on the next contract, or this is the type of thing I would want to avoid if I was going permanent. Or this type of management style didn't work for me. So in the future, if I have an opportunity to be in a management role, you can learn from that. So you really learn from both the good and bad experiences.
Yep.
So I think that's most of what we wanted to talk about. Like we mentioned, we're 3 weeks in. Things are getting a lot better with our contract. We're enjoying the area. Things are going well, so we're really excited to be here. So if you guys want to follow along with what we're up to, just on the weekends and things, I usually post on Instagram on our stories. But let's go through some questions and comments that you guys have. Again, if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to leave them now.
Yeah, we're getting to the point now where things are getting a lot better. We're settling in. I feel much more confident in the clinic. Like I said, I haven't treated patients for a year and a half, and I would not recommend, especially for newer travelers, to do anything like that. Maybe take 3 months off, maybe 6 months off, but it's hard. I would imagine most people never have the experience to take that much time off, but it's hard to get back in there. I don't find that I forget much in terms of treating or that kind of thing, but juggling patients, communication, those are the things that I was pretty rusty with. And obviously documentation systems, that kind of stuff, flow, eval flow, that kind of stuff gets rusty for sure. So, but now we're at the point where I've gotten past that rusty period, and things are getting much better.
I will say too that if you guys have followed us for any amount of time, you may have known, like I said, that we semi-retired. We don't work full-time as physical therapists anymore. And so obviously the question comes up sometimes are we going to continue to work as PTs? Are we going to keep our licenses? And I think that question definitely came up for Jared more because he's taken off even longer periods of time than I have. And so I've been really excited to actually hear him come home and say, this has been really fun. I really enjoy working with these patients. I feel like I've made a difference already. And I feel like he's actually been reinvigorated about being a physical therapist from this contract.
Yeah, to be honest, probably the last 6 months, I've wrestled a lot with whether I should keep a license or let it lapse. And being back on this contract, I was leaning towards not working anymore, honestly. Letting my license go, don't really need to. But being back in this contract and working with patients again, it really reminds me how much I like the job. I know that sounds crazy to some of you guys that are burnt out, or you're working 40 hours a week, it's really difficult. But, if you can step back and appreciate how big of an impact you make with patients and those, the communication, like talking to people, it's things that I didn't realize how much I would miss and how much I did miss it until I got back into it. And now we've been talking about what our future plans might be. And I think I do want to see patients at least 1 or 2 days a week for probably the foreseeable future.
I will say too, hopefully a lot of you guys are also working on your financial independence journey, and maybe in the future that could look like going part-time. It really makes you appreciate what you do more, because if you're only working part-time, you're not dealing with as many of those daily stressors as you have when you're working full-time. And so you can actually pour more of yourself into working with your patients and appreciate it more, and not feel just like it's so daunting and like you dread going to work. I know we're in a very privileged situation to be in that case now, but if you guys have followed us for any length of time, hopefully you've dug into some of our financial content. And if that is a goal of yours, hopefully you can get into a good financial position to where later on you could maybe work part-time if that's something you're interested in. We highly recommend it if it's something you're thinking about. We definitely value our time in the clinic more, and we feel like we can give more to the patients because we're not stressed out as much.
Yep.
So, all right, we'll go through some comments. Hi, Kathleen. Hi, Heather. Hey, Madison. Hey, Jennifer. Hey, Rachel. Thanks for tuning in. Hey, Joel. Hey, Emma. Hey, Chelsea. Hey, Kyle. Hi, Whitney. Hi, Gage. Hi, Deborah. Hi, Nick. Okay, Nick says he's in Milwaukee. Salisa. Nick says his contract has been okay. I came here more for the cheese curds, the brats, and the beer. That's awesome, Nick. We have some good friends that are travel PTs that live in Wisconsin, and we got to go visit them last summer in Wisconsin, and the summer was amazing. So I hope you'll get to be there all summer. We really loved it.
Yeah, I think the winters would be pretty rough, but Wisconsin in the summer was really awesome.
Yeah. Hey, Letha. Okay, Kathleen wants to know, are most clinics pretty good about giving you time and instruction to negotiate the EMR and get a good handle on it, or do they throw you right in and expect you to sink or swim?
Really varies. I would say most, probably 80%, 90% of our contracts, they've been pretty understanding, especially if their documentation system is hard and they struggled with it when they started. Most managers understand that it's going to take you a little bit of time. There are some that are maybe like 1 or 2 contracts we've had that they were almost unreasonable about it. Like, well, you should be productive and you need to get this done. And I think a lot of that is not that they don't understand, but they're just trying to get as much out of you as they can. And I mean, in some ways it's understandable, but you do have to stand up for yourself in those situations. Like, you have to realize that healthcare is a low margin business in a lot of cases. The reimbursement rates aren't high. Managers are pressured from their higher ups to get as much productivity as possible. And if they can pressure you into working a couple hours off the clock and be a little more productive, then they'll do it. And you have to be willing to stand up for yourself in those situations.
Along those same lines, we've definitely had some managers mention kind of casually, like, the fact that they're paying us more. Nobody's ever really been like too abrupt about it, but they'll say, we do have to keep your schedule pretty full. It does cost a little more to have a traveler here. And we've talked to many travelers that by that same token feel bad because they're like, oh, they're paying me more, and here I am, I'm not even as productive as their permanent staff. But pump the brakes. You need to back up and realize why you are there and why they are paying more, not necessarily paying you more, but they have to pay more to get a traveler there because they don't have anyone else, because they're in a difficult situation, because part of the money has to go to pay the overhead for the company, the recruiter, all those things, all the expenses that it costs to get you there, your employment taxes. Part of it goes to you duplicating housing, so you get paid a housing stipend. There are lots of things that go into why a traveler has to be paid more, or why the facility has to put out more money to get a traveler there. None of those things are your fault. None of those things should you feel guilty about. You were there to provide a service because they couldn't get anyone else to provide that service. You entered a contract, came to an agreement. You didn't ask them to hire a traveler. They put out an advertisement for one. You agreed to a contract, so you should not feel guilty. You're only human and you can only do so much. There's no way you're going to be as productive as the permanent staff. You just got there.
And in terms of like how much they pay or whatever for travelers, a lot of times it really isn't a huge difference when you factor in benefits and all that. But even so, let's say it is a big difference. Think about it this way. Are you going to pay more on a nightly basis for your regular rent or for an Airbnb? Short term is always more expensive, right? And you have more costs and all of that as well. So a short-term worker is also going to cost more than a long-term worker. It's the same as a long-term stay is going to cost you less money on a nightly basis than a short-term stay. Having things on demand, having short-term employment it's going to cost you more. And clinics, most of them understand that, but sometimes they'll try to do things to make you feel bad about it, but you should never feel bad about that.
Yeah, it's just the cost of doing business, and you're there to provide a service. It's supply and demand, so you should not feel bad at all. They should have reasonable expectations of what you're able to do. Yes, sometimes they're going to try to push you to do a little bit more, but you can only do as much as you can do, and that's all you can do. All right. Hey, Kaylee. Hi, Diane. Joel says, hi, Joel. I hope you're good, doing well. The quicker you adjust the situation, the better it is for you in the long term. Yeah, definitely. Let's see here. He said, my first 2 weeks at my current contract, which I started back in July of last year, I had a full caseload in an outpatient clinic within a week, and the hospital paid for about 10 hours of overtime my first 2 weeks alone without questioning it.
Yeah, I think that is usually the situation. They know that it's going to take you a little longer if you have a full caseload and you're brand new. You're going to have extra hours. So I think usually they're pretty understandable about that, but every now and then you run into a situation where there's pushback, and then sometimes the conversation's uncomfortable, but for the most part, you don't really run into that.
Yeah, so we've had some clinics that gave zero pushback. They were just like, oh, yeah, that's how much long it took you, it's fine. But when they do pushback, you just have to know when to stand up for yourself. Hey, Owen, good to see you. Let's see here. And Joel commented that was because they were so understaffed. And yes, that's definitely the case. Like, Jared had a contract where he worked so much overtime because they had zero other physical therapists in the whole other area. He was the only PT in the facility. They had no PRN. They had no options. It was skilled nursing. They had to see the patients because if they can't provide PT services to the patient when they get there, then the hospital or whoever won't send the skilled nursing patient to them. So, they have to have it. So whether or not they have to pay him a couple hours of overtime, it's like they would either have the patient or not have the patient.
And at that point, I was willing to work any hours they gave me. I was trying to work all the time back then. And I worked 200 hours of overtime in one contract. So sometimes you'll run into those where they'll work as many hours, they'll let you work as many hours you want to work, and they'll just pay it.
Yep. Let's see. Nick said, I had a lot of fun last night in Milwaukee, but I can't share it here. Thanks for censoring. Owen mentioned some hikes that we should check out in the area. Thanks, Owen. We're super excited. We have only done a couple of small hikes in the immediate area, but next weekend we're hoping to get out more into the mountains.
Yeah. Are these in Shenandoah National Park, I would imagine?
Yeah, we're near Shenandoah National Park, which is our only national park in the state of Virginia. So ironically, even though we're from Virginia and we've been to all the national parks, we've only been to Shenandoah one time. So we'll have to go again while we're in the area.
Yep.
Joel says, I also love doing lots of hiking every weekend. Yes, we love to explore new hikes. Joel mentioned Owen mentioned a couple other hikes. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Old Rag, that's the only hike we've ever done in Shenandoah.
Joel mentioned that he has 23 months until semi-retirement. Yay! Congratulations, nice. Joel. That's really exciting.
That's really exciting.
Yeah, we're so happy for you.
You're going back to the Philippines?
Owen also mentioned some restaurants. Thank you. Hey, Joey. Hey, Kathleen. Kathleen says, thanks for sharing your insight. I've been an outpatient PT for 30 years, but I'm looking into traveling. That's great, Kathleen. We know a lot of therapists that get into traveling later in their careers as well. I will say it just depends on if you've worked at the same place for 30 years or if you've bumped around. Sometimes it can be harder to adjust if you've been at the same place for a long time. And in that case, again, you just have to really stand up for yourself as a clinician. Like, hey, I'm a little, it's a little bit hard for me to learn this new documentation. I'm going to do the best I can. But you can totally do it.
Yeah. And when we were interviewing for these jobs, I was upfront with all the managers we talked to. And I was like, I haven't been in the clinic for a year and a half. I'm going to be a little slower. And, they were willing to work with that.
Yep. Madison, great question. Madison said, if you work overtime, is that paid at the same hourly rate that's in your contract?
Good question. This depends on what you negotiate. A lot of travel companies, it's kind of changed over the years. It used to only be time and a half of your hourly rate, and that was pretty standard for most companies. There was a lot of pushback on that, as you can imagine, because your hourly rate might be $25 or $20 an hour, so your overtime rate would only be $30 or $35 or something like that. So not very much money to make overtime.
Because in that situation, you're not getting paid any additional stipends.
Yeah,
for
so your stipends
hours.
won't change if you work more hours. Those are set. Your living expenses, your meals, that doesn't change based on how many hours you work. So in most cases, it was based on your taxable rate. But since there's a lot of pushback on that, now I think most companies, especially if you bring it up, they will do some sort of compensation for that. So it might be a set hourly rate for any overtime you work. So maybe it's $60 an hour for any overtime hours, or maybe they do triple your hourly rate, or there's a variety of different things that companies will do, but you should definitely not just be getting time and a half of your taxable rate, because that's going to be too low of an amount. So I would say, anywhere 50, 60, 70. I've heard some people getting like $85 an hour overtime. It'll depend on what the travel company can negotiate with the facility, but it should be definitely in that higher end.
And this is something that you're negotiating back before you sign your contract. So when they present the contract to you and it says, this is your hourly rate, this is your stipend, this is your overtime rate, this is your holiday rate, it should be written on there. And if it looks like it's a low number, like it's only time and a half, I would discuss it at that point. We've had some recruiters that will push back and say, it doesn't matter anyway, you're not going to work overtime. These companies don't pay overtime. And to that we would say, yeah, some of them do. As you saw, Jared worked 200 hours of overtime on a contract. Joel has worked multiple hours of overtime. It depends, and it's hard to know before you get there if that's going to be the case or not. So it's better to just go ahead and have it written in if you can.
Yep.
When you sign the contract. Joel says he plans to do 6 months of work and 6 months of traveling around the world. We love it, Joel. That's the lifestyle that we've been living, so we highly recommend it. All right, so if there's no more questions, we'll wrap up for tonight. But as always, we always go back if anybody watches later on the replay and leaves any comments, or if you're listening on a different platform later, just feel free to shoot us a message and we'd be happy to help. Madison says, awesome. Okay, thanks. Good to know. Thanks for your insight. You're the best. Thanks for tuning in, Madison. We appreciate it. All right, guys.
Yep. Any questions you have? If you got any value from this, please like the video, leave us a comment, let us know. We always appreciate it. Hopefully, it's been a month. This is the longest we've gone without making a video.
Well, that's not true. Remember, we went 2 months when we were in South America.
Oh, did we? 2 whole months?
Yeah, we've been a little inconsistent this year. Sorry, guys. Earlier this year when we were in South America, we didn't make any videos.
We went from weekly to bi-weekly to like sometimes. But hopefully we pick back up with the bi-weekly.
Yeah, our goal is to try to do one every 2 weeks. So hopefully we'll see you again in 2 weeks, but we'll see.
Yeah. All right, take care, everyone.
All right, bye.
Bye.